A year after the terrible Tiananmen massacre in Beijing, I was visiting a friend. He was a professor. I was visiting him unannounced. I knocked on his door. He opened it up and he was in a beautiful Chinese suit. And he said, "Oh, come in." And there were 3 other elderly men in the apartment. And I said, "Come, we are raising a glass and toasting the person who brought the largest revival in the world to China." I said, "I'll raise a glass to that man." I thought they would say a name like Watchman Nee or Wang Mingdao. So they all raised their glasses. And then they said, "To Mao Zedong. To Mao Zedong." And I just about spat my drink at them. "Mao Zedong," I said. "Mao was a monster, wasn't he?" And they said, "Yes, but God has a use for monsters too." And I said, "Well, how did Mao bring good to the church?" They said, "Well, think of it this way. Before Mao came along, the Chinese people," they said, "were not very religious. Oh, yes, we were Confucian, we worshipped ancestors, but there was nothing very transcendent about it all. Then along comes Mao Zedong. And he stands up, and in his first speech he said, 'We are going to build heaven on earth.' Heaven on earth," he said. "And we're going to do it with faith. Faith in the truth." And then he organized everybody into little, what he called struggle meetings, but they were really churches. And they were repentance meetings where you had to take the red book, his sayings, and you had to read them, and you had to say, "Oh, I have not come up to the standard of Mao." And you repented in front of everybody, and you were forgiven. And then he would come out at the height of all this to the balcony in Tiananmen Square. Millions would gather, and they would take their little red books, and they would go like this towards him. And he would just hold his hands out like this. He wouldn't say a word, and they would go like this again. And he said, "Do you know what Mao was teaching us? What were they doing in the square?" He was teaching the Chinese people to worship. Worship. Worship him, of course. And I said, "Well, what good is that?" I said, "Well, wait for the story." Mao dies in 1976. Now, gods aren't supposed to die. And the few evangelists who were in jail were released, and they were allowed to start traveling around the countryside again for the first time in many, many years. And they would get to a village, and they would start to speak about Jesus Christ, and the people would say, "Stop!" And they would say, "What?" "We want to believe," they would say. And the whole village would just believe, again and again and again. Revival swept through the land. And they said, "Well, wait a minute. We've got a Bible, we've got a lot to tell you." They said, "We can see what's happened. We thought Mao was God, but he can't be God because he's dead. Gods don't die. We see that Jesus Christ is God because he sits at the right hand of the Father forever. We will give our worship to Jesus now." And so that's why they were raising a glass to Mao Zedong. He was, in their view, the biggest and greatest pre-evangelist in the history of the church, because the church grew from less than 1 million to over 50 million in the 80s, the period they're talking about, over 80 million today. He thought he was annihilating the church. He put the pastors in jail. He burned the Bibles. He closed the churches. In actual fact, he was actually creating the world's largest revival. He didn't know it. That's why they raise a glass and thank God for Mao Zedong. God has the last laugh, and so do we.